In this inaugural episode, we wanted to start with something we take for granted when we discuss investing: Economics 101. We assume what we are taught at the undergraduate level about marginal demand, supply, etc., is like a law in physics. Turns out that's not true, even less so in India. So much that an Indian economics professor decided to write an economics textbook from an Indian perspective. Join me for this special conversation where my Ziritha colleague Bhuvan and I speak with Alex Thomas, a professor at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru. Alex received his economics education from the universities of Madras, Hyderabad, and Sydney, where he also taught. He has published in both national and international journals. Enjoy our conversation about investing in India. Welcome. Thank you for making the time today. Should I call you a professor?
No, please call me Alex.
Okay, welcome, Alex. Let's sort of dive in with this textbook that you wrote, and you're a professor at Azim Premji University. First question, firstly, how did you sort of get into economics at all? What sort of attracted you to economics, the field of economics?
Okay, so I think I have to maybe start a little earlier than in the last 10 years, but I think it happened when I was in school. Partly because I don't think I did well in the other subjects, so this was an accident partly.
Which year talking about?
This year, well, it's 2000, let's say, yeah. And so after that, but then economics something made sense to me, and so I thought, okay, this is something that I'm potentially interested in. But then my mother, who is from Andhra, so I had gone to her hometown, and what I did notice was this striking inequality between, so you have a thatched house here, and just beside it you have a high rise. So that was something that I thought economics could answer. So that led me to exploring more of economics. And here, I mean, because some of the viewers might be from finance background, I want to say that I actually thought my first option was a BCom degree, but then I realized that I don't want to do any more accounting, but I would rather do more.
BCom, so I won't recommend it.
I would do more economics.
So which year do you start economics in? This is which state also?
So I studied in Kerala, but at that time we had this option of choosing economics in class 8. So the choice was between economics and computer science.
Okay.
So I went to because economics nobody had heard of.
Weird choice. Economics or computers.
Exactly. And then I went to that class, I remember, in computer science, and they did a lot of coding. I was like, I can't understand this, so let me go to economics. So actually it was a lot of things that didn't work out that led me to economics.
So I grew up in UP, in a small town, and year 8 May there was no economics at all, which is why I was finding it interesting. But then I jumped a couple of years and found myself in year 11, and that's when I studied economics in Hindi, Arthashastra, and education.
Okay.
That was quite interesting. When did you study economics?
So my earliest recollection is, in school I vaguely remember having some of these intro concepts. It's mostly those demand and supply lines. But
School meaning before year 8?
I think high school, roughly. But the clearest memory I have is MBA. I used to be one of those last benchers. I remember this teacher teaching law of diminishing returns. It was so boring, I'm pretty sure like 3 people used to listen to the class. It was mostly just intersecting lines, this thing. I remember it was, I don't want to call it bad, it was so rigidly formal that you could draw 4 lines, write some nonsense saying that India is a mixed economy, this blah, 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 and you get 40, 45, which was pretty high bar for us high achievers. And it was not a subject most people bothered with, in fact. Even though it gives you a better understanding of real life, I think at that point most of us were immature to understand that maybe this can answer, like you mentioned, the thatched houses is the high rise. This could answer a lot of questions, but I don't think we had the maturity to understand it. But once you get into a household, see that how money moves, etc., once your first paycheck comes, I think things started becoming a little clear. But yeah, I was too dumb to understand that this actually was a little useful.
I must say in UP there were no high rises, so I never definitely didn't have that insight. But I do sort of remember that my textbook wasn't as interesting as this one. This one seems
cool.
like very, very cool. Yeah, they've taken actually all of economics and they've put it into very short lessons, like 2-3 pages each.
This DK
But
guy's
they're
gonna
kind of
brilliant.
a very sort of random organization. You wrote this textbook. I don't actually have an original textbook and I don't remember who wrote the textbook that I studied. But this is what I did more recently when I was making the courses that I make. So my first question is, why write a textbook? What was wrong with the textbooks that were being used at the time that you thought about this?
Yeah, okay, actually I must say that, I didn't have plans to write a textbook first. That also happened by accident. But first, I'll probably give you a brief of that and then get into the more substantial reason for writing it. It was because Onisha Rana, who's the editor of Cambridge University Press, happened to visit Azim Premji University, and then we had this meeting, and we were talking about what could be the potential manuscripts that one could write. And I think I got very excited about the course that I was teaching, which is macroeconomics for a first-year undergraduate student. And then she asked me, why don't you consider writing a textbook? But the thing for me was that I am not a huge fan of textbooks because I think that they generally are very restrictive. They're written in a way that don't push the reader to think. There's a certain dumbing down that happens. So I wanted to write something that was addressed at students, but also not in the conventional way of writing a textbook. And most particularly, I did not want to take a very strong passive voice. I wanted to make my writing speak directly to the reader. So those were the things that I was more interested in, how I can communicate rather than the content, and that took me quite a long time to figure out, to get that right pitch, I think.
Well, this doesn't read like a textbook. Like I've read it, and even for the questions, I kind of skimmed through it. I think my personal favorite is you intersperse those Indian regional literature anecdotes, quotations, etc. Like for example, Dalit literature, etc. Like was that intentional? Because I don't think even the Western books do that a lot.
No. So one is that actually, I think when I was finishing my PhD, this was in I think 2014 or so, from the University of Sydney. I don't know, I got interested in, let's say, developing a course called English for Economists. Now, the reason for that was you have something called mathematics for economists, but then you don't really understand some of the emotions that are involved, which can come out, I think, only through good fiction.
Right.
It could be sympathy, it could be anger, it could be sadness, but I think that, as human beings, we all face it, and I curated a course as in I had a list of books that I thought can go into this course. I didn't think I could teach it because, I think it required a literature person, maybe 2 people could teach it. So I had that list ready. And then when I was writing this book, I thought I wanted to be a little creative, maybe a little too creative, I would think. And in the future, I might try to be a little more conservative. But I thought maybe I could bring these in to talk about some of these important issues, whether it's relating to questions of land, because people, it's not just an asset, people have emotional ties to land. Similarly with gold, there's a culture of how people feel about gold. So how do I bring these issues in? So one option I thought was, okay, I can look at journal articles that economists have written, but I didn't want to do that. I thought, let me look at fiction written by people who might be closer to those lived realities. And I thought, let me bring that in. And also not to, have a hierarchy between non-fiction and fiction.
Right.
And in fact, I tell this in many places that I think when people are writing fiction, a certain kind of lived reality, they don't have any constraints of what is the scientific method, the peer review, the format. You're really free to express it in any way you want. So to me, they are really at the forefront of human knowledge as compared to, I would think, journal articles.
There's a school of thought in education that you first sort of teach something as if it's a fact. This is what it is. And then once people understand it, then they can kind of go and see the nuances in that. So I thought economics would be something similar, where we were just taught this is the marginal rate of this or whatever, right? And then maybe as we progress, perhaps do a PhD, perhaps work in markets, perhaps work in policy, we might then see the nuances. I would have thought that would be the approach taken, but that's not the approach you've taken. So tell us sort of what prompted you to straight away expose students to this is not just one way of thinking, here's multiple ways of thinking. What prompted you to do that?
Yeah, no, so I think this is this is an important question, and I've just taken a particular position because I think while teaching students, some students maybe respond better to the approach that you just mentioned. But what I felt was because of the way economics has an importance in current world, I don't think any other discipline is so close to policy making as economists are. Which also means that there's a lot more responsibility, which also means that the nuance and the caution or the way in which the limitations come about needs to be stressed even more. So I think partly it was that, and it's very few people I think who, let's say, finish their studies in economics and get into markets and who have an open mind. Similarly, who get into a PhD and are willing to learn later. So most people might finish their bachelor's and get into a corporate job or get into any job for that matter where there is no time for that kind of learning and there's no need for that kind of learning. But the actions have certain kind of consequences maybe for their own job or for the policy or for other people. So because my colleagues and I have these discussions sometimes saying that, isn't this too much? Wouldn't the student be confused? But my way of responding to it is one, in school, even in school we have so many subjects. Essentially we are all trying to make sense of our physical and social world, but we break it down. So I think that we are doing very similar when it comes to economics too, but there is some kind of a resistance. And I think maybe we underestimate our learners. I certainly think that confusion is beneficial for learning more.
Even more so because whether they work in markets or whether they work in policy, we don't know, but they will certainly vote. Yeah. Right? So they will certainly become a responsible citizen and have to vote, for which they have to sort of understand different economic theories. Exactly. I guess exposing them early is not a bad idea because they're starting to vote there. Speaking of which, can you maybe just outline the different economic theories that you have addressed in this book and which ones are relevant to India?
Sure. Actually, I just wanted to add to when you mentioned that point about voting. Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, one of the things that he actually says why education is important and why everybody should be educated is precisely this. If you want to live in a democracy, then we have to be able to vote and we have to be able to distinguish and compare different kinds of standpoints. And so, so you're absolutely right. And I think that's certainly, I would say, an even more important reason to have those multiple perspectives. Now to your question of what are the different kinds of theories. So the predominant theory that exists today that has dominated, I think, academia, but also policy circles. People sometimes call it neoclassical economics, but I've used the term which is more specific. It's called marginalist economics. And the other school of thought is classical political economy, sometimes shortened as classical economics. And I'll just give you maybe just a brief of how they differ. So marginalist economics is called marginalist economics because they use concepts like marginal cost, marginal revenue, to talk about how wages are determined, how prices are determined. Whereas in classical political economy, there's a different analytical framework itself. It's built on what is called the surplus approach, whereas for marginalist economics, they assume scarcity. Right. And the approach that I have taken in my book does not just stop with classical economics. It's in that tradition, but I also bring in Keynes's economics. Keynes, who wrote the general theory in the 1936, also into the book, because I think that it offers a fruitful alternative. Now, I must also add that research in these traditions continue to happen. So there are journals which are specifically devoted to what is called heterodox economics or non-mainstream economics. So research has continued to happen in all these areas, but what we learn as textbooks is only the mainstream one. So what I wanted to do in my book is, I didn't want students or people to wait till they've gone to their master's or their PhD to be exposed to a different school of thought. I wanted them to be exposed to it as early as possible, maybe in their first year of undergraduate, or even I would say in school, because I think it's important to say that there are different paradigms in the different schools of thought, and the student can choose what they want to choose.
Got it. So you use the term political economy. I think I remember watching one of your talks, and if maybe I'm wrong, so the term economics came much later. It was earlier called as political economy. Right. So what's the history behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, initially people used to use the term political economy, and especially the way in which Adam Smith understood it was, it served two purposes. One is that it had to take care of the people and also the state. So the state needed to have enough revenue and the people needed to have enough income. So that was the idea. But I think in the 1870s, economists who were working in that tradition, who wanted to get away from some of the political economy traditions, they were influenced by engineering, physics. So people like Stanley Jevons, right. Leon Walras, Menger. So and I don't think it was all intentional, there's a lot happening behind, but essentially people thought it might be better to call it economics like physics. So it seemed more scientific, and you didn't want the word political anymore. And I just want to add here that today when we take up a microeconomics book, they tell you that what we are teaching you is positive economics. Positive economics in the sense what is, not normative economics, what should be. So we don't want to talk about prescriptions or what ought to be, but we are really treating you the facts of the world. And even this separation, I think, is deeply problematic. Right? So whereas political economy acknowledges these power relations, these different kinds of systems of thinking, which is not really there in the mainstream thought.
But in real world, there's no separating them, right? Like economics at some level is making distributional choices, which is inherently always political. So there's no...
True. I mean, you said it very simply and I think to the point. But so the question then is, let's say when RBI takes a position on the interest rate, it is a distributional position. But we don't really see so much debate about, let's say, workers debating why the interest rate can have distributional consequences. Or for that matter, maybe a more radical thought, why don't we have a person from agriculture in the RBI, or why don't we have somebody who represents workers in the RBI, because it's a distributional choice. But I mean, it's interesting you should mention it, because that is exactly what political economy is about, and income distribution being at the center.
Got it.
But because it is political, I think there was some reluctance to maybe acknowledge it. So I mean, I think what we're trying to do here is also to make it, make people aware that there are these interconnections. So actually, when I was doing one of the book talks, somebody told me, ask this question. And I think that genuinely asked me, how can you talk about caste and gender in macroeconomics? And I do not blame that student, because it's just reflection of what this culture of economics has done to people, thinking that we can separate them out.
Right.
So the aim was really to try and reintegrate what, like you said, that the reality is not divided like that. But it's fine when we are studying something to separate out other things, but we cannot forget those other things, and we need to be aware that they are interconnected.
So just linking that a bit more formally, so you explained marginal, classical, Keynes being the major sort of theories. How do they correspond to the politics? So what becomes left and what becomes right? For someone who might not go and do the economics textbook, how do you relate it?
Yeah. So I think the basic, what is called the standard version, the marginalist would favor non-government intervention. The Keynesian would favor some government intervention, and the classical economist would also favor some government intervention. But in practice, with marginalist economics, if we are able to assume imperfect competition or immobility of labor and capital, any political position is consistent with marginalist economics. And I think, to me, this is the dominance for the reason why marginalist economics is dominant is because, irrespective of your political position, you can find a justification from that theory. But maybe a philosopher of science might say this is not a good quality for a theory because you can explain anything you want.
It's too elegant for its own good.
Or, I mean, yeah, if something explains everything, then how do we really rely on it? Whereas for classical economics, I think it can only support certain kind of propositions. Keynes's economics also can only support certain kind of propositions, so not the full spectrum of propositions. So I think to make a one-to-one correspondence between a political standpoint and the theory is a little difficult, except in the standard, the simplest, in a competitive economy framework.
So if you take a step back, like, is there any interesting historical context in which this idea is developed? Because they are diametrically opposed to each other in many ways, if I'm not wrong.
So there is, okay, I mean, this is also a question that I get quite a bit because people sometimes argue that, okay, now the world has changed. When the world has changed, we needed new theory.
Right.
But it isn't like that, because even when Adam Smith is writing, even when Ricardo is writing, there were people who were called proto-marginalists or early marginalist thinkers. But at that time, Smith and Ricardo, their economics were dominant. Then their economics got submerged and Jevons and Walters emerged, or they were dominant, but they continue to be dominant even now. So I don't think it's so much to do with the changing, I mean, little bit is about that, but at the core there is something about what is it that we can do, right? Whether the government should intervene or the government should not intervene. And just as a simple example to our previous discussion that we had, which is in the basic form of the marginalist theory, if you have minimum wages, which is supposed to come on top of that equilibrium point, what the theory tells us is that there will be unemployment. Right? So from that theoretical standpoint, so if I go into a corporate sector or anywhere else, my immediate thing is, okay, minimum wage is bad. So any government which might say minimum wages, we will be suspicious of it because it's actually going to lead to unemployment. But whereas in classical political economy, that kind of a inverse relationship does not exist. In fact, it's seen as something that is good for the people and the economy.
Got it.
Also, just sort of to that point, why just talk about theory? Could there be made an argument that surely we can see the data in terms of what has worked, what has not worked. Different countries have done different experiments. Therefore, we can conclude that this ideology is better than this. What would you say to that? There's enough data now to be able to prove what has worked, what hasn't worked.
Okay, so I must say that I think my relationship with data is a little, not so straightforward. I mean, that is to say, I think that I have some philosophical dissatisfactions with data, especially data which involves human beings. So I think it's very different when it comes to physicists, working on atoms. But when it comes to human beings, it's a slightly more trickier thing. But even having said that, I think, I see some of these journal articles. For any one position, people have used data and found the opposite position. Now, I don't think this is only the case with economics. It's also the case with, I would say it's also the case with medicine. Right? Especially on, let's say, today somebody says coconut oil is bad, tomorrow research will say it's good. Right? So when it comes to diet, there's a lot of research which happens both in the sciences and social sciences which give very opposite results. So I think completely relying on data alone will not give an answer, but then the question is, if we have data, I agree with that, which kind of theoretical framework are we using to understand that data? So then I think that's the other question, and maybe depending on the theoretical position, the answer that one gets might change.
I mean, not to butcher this quote, but I mean, it's a little morose, but I think Stalin or somebody said when X people die, it's people. After that, it becomes a number. So, with economy also, like we are abstracting millions, in our case, literally a billion individuals. And we use, you know, 3 alphabet letters, GDP, GVA, etc. And in your book, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much, but I sense dissatisfaction behind using this very abstract and very hand-wavy terms to describe what's happening in economy. In fact, I think one of my favorite bit was you talk about the need to focus on a district level economy, like some Kannur is different from Malur or whatever.
Right.
Like, is that the right way to look at an economy? Is there a different approach? Should we disaggregate a lot more things rather than abstract them everything and put it into one neat, elegant number?
Okay, so I mean, again, this is, I mean, I think this is also at the core of what kind of world we want to be living in. And the perspective that I've taken, I mean, because it's a macroeconomics book, is that there is value in capturing aggregates. So we want to say something about India's GDP. But if you're looking at policies, I believe that we want to go a little local level. And maybe the panchayat or the municipality who has a better understanding of the surroundings can formulate a policy in line with the cultural context.
But do we track data as of today at this level?
So not, I mean, no, I don't know, but I think even if they do it, it's mostly to, at the district level, it can be representative. Right. For instance, the National Sample Survey Organization, they do capture data. But I think the purpose and the way it is used is not, I think, at the district level or at the local self-government, I mean, or at the panchayat level or the municipality level.
Right. Got it. But then, like, a follow-up would be, is there a better way of representing these aggregates, or are we doing a better job? Like, are the existing metrics good enough?
No, I think that there's always possibility for improvement because, I think I mentioned in my book as well, Phyllis Dean in the late 1950s already had said that women's work is not being captured by GDP. But we are still struggling to get care work acknowledged in a particular way. That could be one. The other aspect is any manufacturing, whether it's services or agriculture or manufacturing or services, all pollute.
Right.
So is there a way to reduce the cost of pollution that we all do, whether it's a university, whether it's a financial company, any company, because of use of course, electronic waste, all kinds of things. Is there a way to incorporate that also in our value added? And people talk about green GDP, but I think it's a very difficult thing to convert, the cost of carbon dioxide into a monetary value.
We have tried, it's not working so well.
So, I mean, I think, but the point about the macroeconomics here was that, to go back to your question, is when we study macroeconomics, sometimes we don't get into, let's say, what happens at
the
firms.
Micro details.
And yes, we can focus on that, but we need to have some understanding of the micro and the meso as well.
Just taking a step back, sorry, one question, I'll get my fanboy moment out. In all these things, there's a lot of unsaid thing, which is essentially when you try to measure something, that idea must come from somewhere. When you try to implement a policy, it's usually backed by something. When somebody says something, it's usually informed by something. Like, what's the source from where all these economic ideas come from, which eventually inform policy actions? Like, what's the taproot, so to speak?
That is certainly an impossible question to answer, I think. But one way to think of it, and I think that's the way that we've been talking about it, is certainly what we study. So certainly textbooks in that way become important. Many of our frames of thought are guided by what we learn, or the people that we look up to, what are they doing. So I think both of that come together. And I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do in my book is to ensure that we are conscious of where we get this knowledge from. We might be taking it from multiple schools of thought, but are we really clear about that? Are we transparent about it? Because then, let's say, if any government takes its ideas from a little bit from Hayek or a little bit from Keynes, if it is made clear, then we know what the basis is. And then we have a better way of understanding their policy standpoint. But now, very often when I look at many of the reports, there are only numbers.
Right.
Although all of them are coming from a certain new Keynesian, which has got nothing to do with Keynes, but a new Keynesian
We
paradigm.
should get into that, but go on.
A new Keynesian paradigm.
Right.
But it's just numbers, so how do we, nobody, the reader is not really aware how to make sense of it. All of us have our own way of reading the numbers, but very often there is some theoretical background lurking somewhere.
Right.
And I think that today we are also moving from saying that, okay, theory is not very relevant, but I think they inform us whether we know it in a conscious or in a subconscious manner.
So I have another question if I were to take the West, roughly post-70s, we can say it's the dominance of free market, neoliberalism, whatever fancy terms. Does that mean our own economic framework, which is used by policymakers, etc., is far more polluted and sort of a chimera sort of thing compared to the West's clear dominance of, let's say, one sort of an ideology?
So this is something that I've been puzzled by, because we very often look at America and think that they're free market, but one look at their
Government debt.
Government borrowing, yes, but there's a lot of investment that goes into R&D. So even for private players to be able to, and there's a nice book by Mariana Mazzucato on this entrepreneur state, which is to say that, and I think even this, first, I don't think America is a free market economy. But two, I think this separation between market and state, I think, is a false dichotomy. Because for any government to function, we need people to be exchanging, we need markets.
Right.
For a market to function, we need the state to enforce certain kind of rules and regulations. So from the time of Adam Smith, I think Adam Smith is very clear about it, that the state is absolutely important to ensure certain freedoms, but also to ensure certain rules and regulations.
But he's often held up as the patron saint of free market economies, which is wrong, I'm assuming?
Yes, I think absolutely it's wrong, because it's the historical context that Smith is against is mercantilism, which was more about the state and big businesses coming together, East India Company being a good example of that.
Right.
And so he's talking about giving freedom to smaller entrepreneurs, but all the while recognizing that the state has a very important role to play in education, in ensuring rules and regulations. So, and just in case people don't know, actually the term invisible hand is just used once in his Wealth of Nations book.
Yeah, it's taken a life of its own.
Yeah, so.
Got it. So that means, I made a mistaken statement, which is America is free economic, so on and so forth. So that means often what is written in the books, what happens in the real world, like, how do you think about the difference, in the sense that the neat reality of models versus the messy reality of reality? Like, in the sense that what I'm trying to ask is, by the time, let's say, you write a paper which eventually informs policy debates, etc., etc., in between the translation, I'm assuming a lot changes?
Yeah, so I must say that I don't have any experience of this as such, but I think today what economists seem to be doing is trying to be closer to the policy realm, trying to give even more specific policies. But I think my position is that maybe we want to be a little cautious and let officials who can, let's say, pick and choose between multiple options, decide what is the best way, because I think that's a different skill from the skill that, let's say, I have, which might be to break down certain things and put it into a neat conceptual apparatus, or somebody else might be able to analyze data and say something meaningful and make policy recommendations. But again, maybe the politician of that place or the civil servant of that place has a better idea of the local situation. So I think, one, maybe we want to work more hand in hand with the administrators, or we continue to produce knowledge and let's hope that they will make use of it.
I'll let you get your questions in.
Just finishing on the textbook, actually. So how do you explain someone choosing a certain policy action? Say, if the textbooks are the same, the professors are teaching the same thing, which is only one way of thinking, how do people then become independent thinkers currently? And I'm just curious now, what are you hoping to change with your textbook?
Okay, so I think this is also a difficult question in the sense, I mean, I think about this issue a lot because in our educational system, certainly in India, we are all taught to think in a standardized way.
I can attest to that.
We're all, I mean, and it's the same in college too because you have the same kind of exams and most times we are expected to write the same answer. So if somebody writes a different answer, it's not clear how they're looked, how they're assessed. So I think that this culture is, academia is a strange culture that way because you expect a lot of people to do everything in the same way. But then you value creativity and independence. But you don't really, the space does not offer it, but you expect it. So, I don't know. It's really a paradox in that sense. And I think what I'm trying to do with this book is really, at least for people who, even if they might be choosing to go in the mainstream way, are a little more aware of the limitations of that approach. What are some of the historical reasons maybe? How might you connect it with some of the more lived realities? So I think my attempt in this book is really to make people a little more thoughtful and a little more humble.
People say when they're coming of age, whatever the environment is at the time, that's what sort of influences you pretty much for the rest of your life. But that doesn't explain why then people choose two different ideologies.
So maybe if you sit in the back bench, that might help. I sat in the back bench.
Certainly did for me, which is how I found your book.
I was a front bencher, although it was sent to the back because I was tall. Okay, so are we done with the textbooks?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so let's shift gears and now talk about the Indian economy. Maybe starting with, I guess, the Western world, whatever textbooks they've read, they're applying that lens to when they see the Indian economy. What might they miss if they do that?
Yeah. I think there are two ways in which at least I've dealt with this question in my book. One is that the mainstream from the West also just looks at what is dominant today, which is marginalist economics, and not really seriously even other ideas that have been produced in the West. So there is that bit to it. But I think your question is more about the local context and the local Indian context itself. So one is certainly how do we understand the informal sector. Again, I do not have answers for it, but I'm just going to try and complicate things.
In fact, explain the informal sector, because I don't think many people in the West even realize that.
True. Okay. So the idea of the informal sector, the idea of the formal sector, and then the informal sector is understood in response to that, is that you have a written contract. So it means that you have, and you also have certain benefits. So that could be
workers
insurance.
have written contracts and benefits. So if they have that, they are in the formal sector.
Formal sector.
And only, less than 20% of India is that, right?
Yeah. But people even put it at around even less than 10%.
10, yeah.
Maybe. But this idea of the formal sector is also coming from the West. But the question, to me the question really is, what we are interested in is how reliable this employment is. What are the working conditions like? Are people respected? Do people have some amount of freedom? Now, it's possible to be in the formal sector, have a written contract and still be unfree. Right? Now, it's possible to be in the informal sector, not have a written contract and still be free.
Gig workers come to mind.
Yeah, so gig workers is a little more, again, how much of freedom they have, and what are the other kinds of
Where
things.
do they count in the normal numbers right now?
So I don't think our policies that we use today can deal with the fact. At least that's my understanding. So there's a little bit of informality in the sense that I don't think there's a recognition at all. So they are in the...
Yeah, because they are seen as individual agents. In a way, because they are just using an app. So they're not employed that way. Yeah. They're considered to be maybe even entrepreneurs in some sense.
So they're considered as independent contractors. So there's a little bit of historical context. There's a bunch of lawsuits going on in London, California, saying that is the platform, let's say Uber, you drive for Uber, are you an independent contractor, or is Uber liable to give you health insurance, workplace benefits, so on and so
I
forth?
think Australia, in fact, has a case on that. But today in India, they consider
There's no
it
legal
self-employed.
classification.
Right.
You're an independent contractor on your own.
Okay. Okay, so the informal sort of sector is a big part of the Indian economy.
And I think one is the history of India itself, which is that we live in a patriarchal society and a caste society, and we are using the lens of capitalism. And one of the ideas of capitalism is that labor is free. Labor is free to move into any sector. So I feel even at that basic stage, even I assume a certain kind of competitive capitalist economy in my book, but it's a problem because are we really capitalist? And I don't think so. But do we have a term to deal with it? I don't know. People have used these terms called varieties of capitalism. So even to describe the Indian economy, I'm not sure we have a more indigenous way of representing it. I don't think it has to be fully indigenous. Of course, Indian economy or the subcontinent has always seen trade from all over the world historically for centuries. But still, capitalism may not be the best way to describe it. And then, I don't have an answer for this question. It's really to say we need a lot more ideas that come maybe indigenously to have a more appropriate representation and then an understanding of the Indian context.
So in one of your talks, I remember you saying capitalism is not the right word, capitalisms, plural is a better word. Like, what did you mean by that?
So, because today now people say the capitalism in Scandinavia is different from the capitalism in US. Right? So even within capitalism, there might be some which are more state-driven,
right,
where let's say they put a lot of money into public investment or research and development, education, health, some which might be a little removed. So, even capitalism is a very broad category to talk about. And I think we were mentioning earlier the idea of mixed economy. Again, that's that I don't know how.
So, that's what I was taught in my textbook.
Yeah, me too. But I'm just saying that we don't think sometimes hard about these conceptual categories, and they have kind of domino influence on many of the things that we do. And I feel there is still work to be done, even just in something as simple as categorizing our society.
At some level, we need labels, but are they unhelpful?
Yeah. Sometimes. I think that if we understand the limitation of the label and the history of the label, then I think it's fine.
Got it.
And as a working, when we are starting to analyze something, I think it's important. We absolutely need labels. But do we stop at that? Because, a similar kind of question is this, that many Western countries have developed moving from agriculture to manufacturing to services. Whereas in the Indian context, people argue that we did not really go into manufacturing, but we just jumped from agriculture to
That would be my contention also. I don't know if it's true, but some data says it's true.
That we moved from agriculture to services.
Because, I don't know if you saw that recent ILO report on labor, this thing. It said that the manufacturing share of employment has remained at roughly 20%. I might be botching the number, but from 2000 to 2021, manufacturing share of employment has remained the same. While services has taken a lion's share of them, created as well as taken from agriculture. So agriculture has been a downward sloping thing. Manufacturing is flat. Services has been upward sloping. Of course, you dig into that, it tells 300 different stories.
Yeah, no, but even then, the expectation was that I think in the 1950s with the 5-year plans, putting into heavy industrialization, the idea was that you wanted manufacturing because that is the way other countries have developed. So we should follow that path, which is also, I think, a little problematic because, every country, every individual has their own path. And the initial conditions really matter. And force-fitting something, to what extent? Whether we were really careful about that. Did we really focus on primary education? Did we really focus on, let's say, women's well-being? Heavy industrialization was seen as the core, and people thought at that time, whatever people believed in.
I think in fact they still do.
So maybe just sort of walk us through that, maybe just the history in terms of what Nehru thought when he put the heavy industries and these ratnas in, and then maybe how the thinking evolved to where it is today, and especially the moment of liberalization, I guess.
So maybe I'm going to give a little, different kind of story, maybe not the standard one, and not in that way, because I also have not engaged with this history so deeply. But one, certainly Nehru's idea of heavy industrialization partly came from this view that manufacturing is able to create value added in a large scale, especially with technological improvements. Whereas in the context of any kind of not service but occupation which relies on nature, there are some constraints. Right? So agriculture, in that way, the effect of technological progress might not be as much as manufacturing sector, and the returns from manufacturing sector is vast. But so when the 5-year plans were put in that way, there were also dissent. People said that we need to focus on what the workers are consuming, what was called wage goods. But then there was that debate, should we focus on heavy industries or should we focus on wage goods, which is really consumption goods for majority of the workers. But I think that debate, certainly heavy industrialization won. Then there was also the question of, at this point, do we want to focus on education? Right? Again, people today argue that there was not enough emphasis given on education, so how do you improve the potential or the capacity of the workers? Again, health. How did we really give enough emphasis to health and education vis-a-vis heavy manufacturing, whether it was steel or coal or gas, industries of that kind. And then in the 1980s onwards, I think certainly, one bit is about freedom itself, right? And actually, this reminds me, a student asked me this question. It's connected to what I'm going to say. And she asked me, now there's a lot of products coming in from Korea. Now, I wasn't sure what was the reason. Of course, I know that Indians watch a lot of K-drama and K-pop and all that. But you were saying that, what about our industries? But my question was, I am not sure whether our industries can produce the kind of products that the Koreans are producing, and who gets to choose. Now, as a consumer, I want to consume Korean products, but as a producer, I don't want competition from Korean products. Now, I think that this is some kind of a trade-off, and how do we make a choice there? So again, going back to pre-liberalization, there were benefits which people saw from liberalizing capital controls, which meant that, let's say that goods from outside can come in easily, and later we can invest money abroad. Because for a long period of time, we could not invest, or capital was not freely mobile across. So one group believing that if we have more open borders, of course not for people, because immigration policy is still very stringent everywhere, but for other things, for finance, for money, for commodities, it will lead to gains from trade, and that both parties would truly benefit. So I think that was the larger view of liberalization, which is about gains from trade. But there I just want to mention one more thing, because the global financial crisis which hit in 2008.
I was about to ask whether it worked out well for us or.
But see, this is the thing that I don't think anything is black and white, good or bad that way. And when we open up our borders, we need to know fully well that what happens in America or Australia, maybe Australia not so much, but America for sure has a huge impact on India because of globalization and how connected we are, especially financial sector and the non-financial sectors. So I think, we just need to manage things, and we need to have that awareness.
At some level, are policymakers, etc., shooting in the dark because future is inherently uncertain?
I'm not sure about that, right? Because there's one view which strongly says that the more free we are, the better it is for everyone. Right? So, but when these episodes of crisis happen, then everyone is like, oh no, this is not right. Then we have to read the economics of Kaletsky, Keynes, Marx. We need to go back.
Right.
But when things are okay, when things are optimistic, people are okay with how it's going. So, but I think one of the key ideas in certainly Keynes and people who work in that tradition is we want to minimize these ups and downs. The government or policy making should be such that we have minimal cycles, what I call in my book an anti-cyclical fiscal policy and not a counter-cyclical one, because the people who get worst hit are certainly people who would be the poorest. Whether it's a climate shock, whether it's a financial shock, whether it's a medical shock or COVID or any kind of shock. So we need to have enough safeguards in place.
So you finished with the history?
Yes.
Yeah. So we started talking about how India is different, and we talked about the formal, informal, and we mentioned a little bit about caste. But maybe just sort of list out in all the different areas, in terms of diversity of language, diversity of weather. I think you mentioned we have some 15 agri-zones or something. So maybe just list out how is India so different that any Western person looking in might make very elementary mistakes?
True. So I think one certainly is because you mentioned it and I recalled it, which is the agroclimatic zones, which are so different. Again, so can we have a unitary agricultural policy, a uniform agricultural policy? Maybe not. Can we have a minimum support price that is completely centralized? Maybe not. So one is certainly the climate and agriculture related. The other would be, like you mentioned, languages and cultural differences. Apart from this is, I think patriarchy is there in all countries to a large extent, for sure. So that I don't think would be so different here. But certainly the caste system would make it very different, although people have likened it to the issue of race in America. But I think that there are similarities, but I think the way in which it works in India, because it's a graded hierarchy, it's not
as black and white as
as easy to decipher, because you could be within the categories, the categories of caste that is administrative, but in actual practice you might be on the upper level or in the bottom level in the local community. So they don't really one-to-one match out. Which also means again that we cannot have a macro policy. Maybe we need to really listen to people who are in local communities, or it has to be more bottoms up.
How does it actually practically manifest itself in terms of what we see? So labor migration is one aspect. What else? You're saying that labor doesn't migrate too far out. That's one. But legally, we have free migration of labor, and we do sort of see people sort of migrating from villages to cities all the time. In fact, all the big cities in India are growing. So tell me, how does caste manifest itself that isn't so obvious to a Western viewer?
Okay, so let me try again, because I'm not an expert in this area, but and I want to go back to the question of employment itself. So Professor K.N. Raj, who actually is, one of the Indian economists who we don't hear about, but he's famous because he set up the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. And he was also part of some of the 5-year plans. He taught at the Delhi School of Economics and all that. When Lewis model, the idea of Lewis model is that if there is a wage differential between agriculture and non-agriculture, and there is surplus labor in agriculture, people would migrate to the manufacturing sector or the capitalist sector.
Sounds very nice.
Right, and so this idea of surplus labor is still very much in people's minds today, how people think about it. And at that time, K.N. Raj had written saying that unemployment is a social problem. It cannot be purely seen as an economic problem where you compare the marginal product of labor and the average product of labor, or you compare simply the wage differences. Because one, how are Indian families designed? Right? Who gets to actually go out? what are the impacts of, let's say, maybe fathers going out? So I think that there's a lot of cultural element, and this is maybe not a problem of Western economists. I think it's a problem of economics, right? There, because we tend to reduce everything to economics. In one hand, that's good because you want to make it manageable. But when you're in the service of policy, you should be talking to anthropologists, you should be talking to sociologists, historians to understand that context. So I think this is one, and who are the people who are formulating rules for minimum wage? And again, the question of, why should the minimum wages for a woman agricultural worker be less than a male agricultural worker? I mean, there's no logical basis for it whatsoever.
Good. Yeah, that reminds me of this one interesting thing you said in one of your, you called it the Robinson Crusoe economy, where the focus of economics today has become individualist versus the collective, directly ties back to this thing. Is that still the way we do policy even today?
So, I mean, it's difficult, I think, when it comes to saying about policy, because most of policy, I mean, let's say some kind of policies like inflation and...
Also contrast with, let's say, we say we look at the individual as the unit of, all the policy actions, whatever. Like, what would the opposite of that also look like?
No, so one, I mean, this is partly, I think, a philosophical standpoint, which, going back to Hansi's question, I don't think any amount of data can solve this problem, which is that, do we study the economy with its fundamental unit as an individual, or is it a group?
Right.
For marginalist economists, it is an individual. For the political economists, it is a social class.
Right.
Now, the advantage of a social class is that it talks about power. So the landlord is more powerful than the capitalist is more powerful than the workers. But when it comes to the individual, it is as if we are all on the same page. So this, I think that this kind has an impact on how we view the world, what kind of data is collected, and even in the kind of understanding that we have of politics. So, I mean, again, macroeconomics is seen in two ways. One, I mean, Keynes argues that you cannot think of it as an individual and then it's like a large individual. It doesn't work like that. And sometimes the example that I give in my class is, you can think of a forest, an ecosystem, but you cannot just think of the forest as a simple summation of the trees.
Right.
Because there are all these interdependencies, interconnections, which we will not understand if we just think of trying to understand the forest from the perspective of a tree. And so it's basically, I think, that structural interconnectedness that comes about. And once we know that, we can try to collect such kind of data as well. So I think even data collection has an impact on our philosophy of the world.
It reminds me of this one example from the book. I think her name was Beena Rai or something.
Beena Agarwal.
So the assumption in economics is that the household income comes and it flows down to everybody, which is not really the case. Most often not the female member of the household gets no share, which is overlooked.
Speaking of which, what does the data say about how well women and also the lower caste is doing? I mean, I remember Ames, was it Rahul Agarwal who burnt himself outside Ames? That was my college days. So affirmative action has been in place for decades now. Has it worked?
Not really, at least. So I just want to maybe just look at this data that I've used from some of my colleagues at the Center for Sustainable Employment, because I don't work with data directly. So what this is on page 149 of the book, where what it shows is that there are some occupations which are maybe closer to, I mean, if there is some hierarchy of occupations, we notice that people who are from lower castes are overrepresented in occupations which are low paying and which people are seeing as, so for instance, what are considered elementary occupations. Right. Whereas in the well-paid ones, upper castes are overrepresented. So I think this kind of a contrast, again, it shows that, I mean, caste is a division of laborers, as Ambedkar would call it. Right? So whereas what economics focuses on is division of labor. But if we have a strong division of laborer, which arises from the caste system or patriarchy, then division of labor concept needs to be adequately modified. And actually in the next page, which is about women and unequal employment in India, you notice again that the share of women workers is 28% in agriculture, whereas only 16% in services.
Right, right.
Again, it sort of shows that the institutional setup has a lot to do. And here again, I don't think, there are people who argue that the markets will solve this problem. There are people who argue that the state will solve this problem. But I think our mindset can be patriarchal or casteist, whether we are a part of the market or whether we are part of the government. I don't think being a part of the market or the government makes us suddenly away from these things. So the only way I feel is to be more conscious of it in our actions, and even if it's there in paper, the implementation of it is done by human beings.
And I have some personal experience of that caste system. Like a few years ago, I was in my native. In fact, I still had examples where people said they are not allowed into the house, this thing, and that directly translates to the workplace also. So if you are from a certain caste, if you go for an interview, and if that person suddenly finds out, and if he's one of those, let's say, old people, the odds are he still has those entrenched casteist views, and the odds of him getting the job, it's very odd. And another personal recollection is certain kind of, when I was young, certain kids from the caste were not allowed into the households. So you had separate plates, separate glasses for them to drink water. You couldn't share snacks. You couldn't eat with them together. In fact, I have stories where certain people got whacked by their parents because they ate a meal with them. And I don't know how much it has changed, but I know for a fact that it still exists. I'm not sure about how virulent it is, but it does.
So that leads us to discussing how well is India doing? What is the measure that you would use if not high-level GDP? And therefore, as an economist, if I were to ask you this question, how well is India doing? How would you describe it?
Very easy question.
No, so I think I'll go back to, what is economics? And the definition that I want to look at is certainly Adam Smith's definition of political economy, which is how are the people doing and how is the state doing? So I think leaving aside the question of how the government is doing, certainly, but if we look at how people are doing, I think that there is a lot more that we can do because whether it's about inequality, income inequality would be one metric, another would be wealth inequality, another would be, I think, access to education, access to clean environment, I think certainly access to health. So I think on all these counts, I think we have much to do. Access to decent housing. I think so if you take those kinds of what I think all of us would consider to be a basic necessary, right? Whether it's health, education, food, quality food, right? And I think that there's a lot more that can be done. But at the same time, I think that it makes it a little more, the contrast is huge because, but we also see a lot of flats, apartment complexes being built and people having the money to buy these flats. So, there are people who are certainly doing well, but there are people who are certainly not doing well. And I think partly that cannot be solved by, however we understand it today. We have to understand initial conditions, we have to understand history and have appropriate policies, whether it's education, whether it's good health, accessible for all. And in that I would also add financial planning. This is not because I have anything to do with Zerodha, but just in general, whatever little money that we have and the power of compounding. Because I think people don't know. Now, whether it's financial health or mental health, I don't think we are taught how to deal with both of them in our school. I think that why did I learn chemistry? I should have been taught about mental health and financial health.
But that's putting it back to personal action when some would argue that I don't have the income. How are you asking me to save? I'm on the brink of bankruptcy here. In the US, in fact, most influencers talk about debt. Okay, at least here in India, we don't talk about that as much. Although the debt levels are increasing. So I guess the question again is compared to, so let me make it more precise, compared to say 10 years ago and compared to maybe 30 years ago, how well has India done? And diplomatic answer is yes, of course we can do better. But how well have we done?
Yeah, but so this question can only be answered with yes and no, or yes but.
Very clear answer.
No, or I mean, but if you were to push me to take a position, I would probably say no, it has not done well enough.
Good.
That would be my answer. And the reason is because I think that it's not because we are lacking in resources. It's just that there has not been enough thought gone into how to improve our resources, whether it's education, health, individual well-being, plus creating jobs. Right?
Is it thought? Is it lack of thought, or is it the word corruption that comes to mind when the West talks about India? I'm asking you, so just maybe riff on corruption in India.
Again, I mean, having no expertise on this, but still, if I were to talk about it, I think of corruption as a consequence of the poor economic state that we are in, and not as a cause. So to me, I see it certainly as a consequence of.
So it is back to lack of thought.
Well,
what can we do better then?
Yeah, no. One certainly. What we can do better for. A simple question that I would have is, we need to build capacity. We need to have, let's say, more think tanks thinking about these issues. But what seems to be happening today in the government is that all that is being outsourced to consultants. Right? These are being, outsourced to big corporates. Again, I don't think that, but I feel if we were able to create an administrative class, let's say more officers in the Indian economic service, or more people who are looking at the society, that is one concrete thing that can be done. But unfortunately, we are going the way of outsourcing all of this to consulting companies, which I find deeply problematic, because I've heard these stories that, okay, we want to show that this district has done well. So do a RCT and give it to me, showing that it has done well, and a consultant will give it to you. Of course, it's not the fault of the consultant, but I think it's the way in which we are thinking about what we can do to progress. And certainly research and development. The government can invest much more in research and development.
But can we afford to? Because, putting my financial lens on the question of access to money comes into picture. Western governments can afford because their debt is in demand. Nobody cares about ours.
In fact, that leads me to, again, the role of credit rating agencies in deciding India's future. Is that a way of colonialism?
Credit colonialism.
Actually, that's a good term. Actually, I hadn't thought of that term.
Trademarks.
No, but the question of debt, there are two things. What mainstream economists tells us is that the government is like a household. A household should not borrow beyond its means. But the government is not a household by any stretch of imagination. And even there, these are all, I think, ideas that have been deeply entrenched into the corporate sector, into the financial world, that if the government intervenes, you will be crowded out.
Right.
Somehow or the other.
Maybe just simplify the household analogy just for clarity's sake.
Yeah. So, if I am a household, it means, and I get a certain amount of income, to be prudent,
right.
To be sustainable, I'm expected to spend within my means.
Right.
So if you earn 100, you should spend 60, 70.
Yes.
Yeah, and save the rest.
Yeah, save. Even if I'm not saving, certainly not.
Don't spend 100.
Don't spend more than 100. Don't borrow. Borrowing in general is seen in a negative light. But the government is not an entity like the household, but the government's objectives are different. Again, it depends on what the objectives are. Is it to secure a certain kind of rating with the credit rating company? Is it to give good life to its constituents? And if that is the aim, then I think that one, we can borrow, and I think that within the post-Keynesian economic thought, and it is very clear, people who are working in alternative traditions have said that what we will actually see is crowding in, because we are nowhere next to what is called the full employment level. There is so much of underemployment, unemployment, capacity is not utilized. We can create capacity. So we are not anywhere close to full employment level, which means that if the government actually steps in and produces what is beneficial, it will help everyone and lead to multiplier effect. So that is one. Of course, I think the key thing is if the government is borrowing, and that's totally okay, but it has to be put into productive uses. Now, if it just simply goes into things which are not building capacity, adding value, then I think the question of debt, and I think it's a question of accountability.
Right.
I think it's absolutely okay for the Indian government to borrow, but how is it being used? One needs to be transparent about it and where it's going to. Then I think it is not an issue. And in fact, I would say even there, if we don't want the central government to borrow, there are municipal bonds. I mean, municipalities can also raise their money where people can have a closer control.
Right.
And I don't know how much, I mean, again, we have to think through what are the limits of these bonds. We want them to be secure. We don't want domino effect. So there, I think the financial sector and the government and academics can actually work together to figure out interesting ways to have financial instruments help development.
So the Indian government sort of spending on, or its plans to spend on things like infrastructure, I think it's $1 trillion plus, and on climate and a whole bunch of things. What can it do better? So when you say it needs to borrow more, what should it be spending on?
I cannot say that answer because the reason is simply, I mean, so it's like this, that even if I want to build a road, but if that road is going through the forest, right? So on one hand, you have road which is good according to, I mean, just what I said, but where is it going through is a question, and what is it displacing? So which is why I feel that it's very difficult to give answers to these questions because essentially they are a little, I mean, they are quite complex because there are some effects to it. So I mean, when I was studying the budget a few years back, this was one of the points that I wanted to make, that it's good that when physical infrastructure investment goes up, but we also have to integrate the climate change or the sustainability aspect into it. You cannot have roads going here and solar energy spaces coming up there, right? There has that, I mean, it has to be more integrated than that.
We just had Economics 101 sort of chart that I think it's in your textbook as well, which leaves out women and climate.
Yeah.
That needs to be fixed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was my favorite part of this. Like, because when I was reading my textbook, there was no mention of environment, nothing. Nobody cared. It was this line. This line goes up. This line goes up. Then it's done. But you introduced, I think I remember, Islands in Flux. It was one of the books you quoted. Pankaj was his name, and a bunch of other examples. I mean, I would certainly say that it's not just an Indian problem; it's a global problem. So we don't really consider the ecological impact in our economic calculations. Not just that, even local communities, etc., etc. Do you think that has changed, is changing, will change? Where do you land on the spectrum?
I mean, I don't know, but I mean, I just want, because I actually in my macro course, I just taught this unit on environment and we just finished it. So the memory is a little fresh. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is how the culture of capitalism and colonialism in our context had a particular view on the local cultures, or I mean, I don't want to call religion exactly, but religions in some sense of the word, right? So if I am praying to a river, I'm not going to pollute that river. Yeah. If I'm praying to a tree, I'm not going to pollute that tree or cut down that tree. So I think that the way in which many of the people lived earlier, at least pre-colonial times, were much more in closer to nature.
Certain reverence for it.
A certain kind of, which meant that we would also not do things. But now with the capitalist logic, it's not like that. You can cut down anything for anything. Really.
As long as it increases GDP.
Yeah. So I think, but how do we bring that consciousness back? It may not be in the form of religion, but a certain kind of consciousness, I think, is absolutely needed. Because, of course, what we are witnessing in Bangalore, in different parts of the world, I mean, the weather climate is changing in absolutely problematic and scary ways.
So we've spoken about communities, we've spoken about caste, gender, patriarchy, so forth. I think the one unsaid variable in this is, by the way, this I heard from one of your talks. You mentioned this intergenerational inequality, and you were talking about in the context of land, because land continues to be passed on to the descendants. Is there more forms of intergenerational inequalities in other forms? Because I remember reading a little bit of research. There's intergenerational. If you're poor, the odds of it being transmitted to your descendants it's very high. Same with health outcomes, even in financial outcomes for that matter. Is it the same with other forms of inequalities? Like, can you talk about it a little bit?
No, so I think that I mean, it's the one way to think of intergeneration is really that we need to pay attention to history and initial conditions, because it really matters whether it's a question of affirmative action or reservation for women. We tend to think at what happened today,
Right.
but we don't look at what happened 50 years back. Now, it's an open question, because where do we stop? Do we stop at 10 years from now backwards? Do we stop at 50? Do we stop at 100? But I think the question of intergenerational equity comes to play certainly, I think, for the questions of caste and gender, because it tells us something about our family structure.
Right.
It tells us something about how property goes from one generation to another and who gets it, and whether these communities had access to property in the first place. So inheritance laws become an important role. There again the question of the government comes in, because do you tax inheritance?
Right.
What is the philosophy behind taxing inheritance? Because one, an argument can be made, I have spent a lot of hard work making this for my children and my grandchildren, and how can the government take it away from me? But the other view could be that I have got all this initial capital from my parents, and it was not through any kind of merit or any fair allocation, but because of various historical reasons, again caste and patriarchy and colonialism, which has helped the elites. So then how do we think about even question of taxation of intergenerational wealth? But I think these are also broadly philosophical, but also very ethical questions to ask. And even when I mention ethics, I'm aware that there are so many different schools of ethics. You can have feminist ethics, you can have a certain kind of ethics which does not pay attention to many of these. So the question of intergenerational equity is tied to the government position on inheritance, our institutional framework of property, our notion of ethics and justice. So which again means that unless we are able to bring them together, we are not really able to operationalize how we want to go about, let's say, taxation. And I like Thomas Piketty on this, because very often when we think of taxes, we think, okay, there's an optimum tax, there's a particular formula for taxation that we can do, bring in some marginal benefit and all that. And Piketty rightly writes that it's a political matter. Yeah. Actually, no formula can really solve this question, because it has to be through a democratic process. It has to be about what people value, whether it's our future environment and ecology, then do we put a tax for that? Or how do we value historical injustice? How do we value primitive accumulation or capitalism? So I think that, yeah.
I want to ask about, it's a totally different from the last question, and something which kind of stood out from your book. You mentioned the prevalence of money lenders in India, and it also, we were talking about financial design earlier. The reason why it stood out is because when I was young also, I don't think my dad took a formal loan until, I don't know, in his 40s. It used to be money lenders borrowing at 30%, 40% a year, so on and so forth. And I mentioned that our entire structure of the financial system, so to speak, is a cut copy paste of the Western world. If in your mind, is there something we could do more in terms of the design of instrument systems, regulations, policies, purely in the financial domain, that kind of makes it indigenous, for the lack of a better word, or solves the problems of, even today our formal financial inclusion rate is very little. There's about 10 crore people who are formally in the markets. But is there more in your mind that could be done? What comes to your mind?
So I think whenever any discussion of financial inclusion comes up, the first thing I think of is employment and quality wages, right? Because I think any amount of financial inclusion without a stable job, stable incomes is totally pointless.
So you're putting the egg before the chicken.
So I mean, it has to sort of go together that way. But let's assume, even if we were to assume that people have incomes, the point that I also make a note in my book is that when it comes to chit funds or money lending, a lot of them are operating on the basis of caste and patriarchal networks. So who are the people who can go to certain money lenders, or can women borrow from, I mean, are the rates of interest the same? One, I think that we need a lot more research in this. But I feel, I mean, possibly these are indigenously developed, and I think today there is a greater look inwards, or going back. But we need to be very careful about this going back, because our history is a history of caste and patriarchy, right? So while we take the good things from there, we don't want to take the things that we don't want as well. And how do we do that carefully? So I mean, I think we need to work on it together. I mean, that would be the way I think of it.
Speaking of going back, that is exactly the question that I had put to Nitin and Samir when we were discussing rain matter. They've developed a philosophy of a very decentralized sort of economics in terms of forming clusters of 10,000 villages or 30,000 villages, I forget now. But then that being the local economy, kind of, I think they use the word going back, which triggered me a little bit because of exactly the reason you mentioned. But from an economics point of view, does that sort of make sense?
So I mean, when you mention this, actually what I'm reminded of is a little bit of what people call Gandhian economic thought. I mean, it reminds me of that. It reminds me of also Kumarappa, J.C. Kumarappa, who's an Indian economist and thinker, who was influenced by Gandhi and did write about self-sustaining village economies, right? And I think I share your concern a little bit that I mean, we live in a globally interconnected world, right? So, and I think that there are some merits to it. Of course, there are some demerits to it. But to completely reject it and go to a smaller system, I'm not sure. But I think that there is value in certainly doing, I mean, for instance, what I think of is if I know where my vegetables are coming from, if I go to the market and if it is locally produced, they can really tell me about the quality of the vegetables. But today I order from, Instamart or something else like that.
It's all faceless and nameless.
It's absolutely, and so is it in a supermarket too. So it has always been there, but it's completely, we are cut off from the producer. And I think the problem here is that capitalism sometimes talks of consumer as the king. But many of us are producers too. So if I get it for a cheap price, somebody else is losing out. But even that consciousness that it's actually we are all in a collective kind of system is lost. Somehow it has been about the individual, we want to maximize it. So, and what are the costs to that? So I think if we are able to bring a better consciousness into the existing system, maybe there are some ways to improve it, but I think there is still value in thinking of a local unit. One, it reduces transportation, means less environmental pollution for sure, and I think the community and we know each other. But of course, knowing each other, given caste and patriarchal systems, we need to be careful about what systems we can ensure, because it's not necessarily free just because it's done locally. And I think.
But where does it stop? I mean, obviously producing local perishable vegetables or food absolutely makes sense. But then going and producing, I don't know, solar panels ourselves, also I can understand supply chain. So where does this stop? From an economics point of view, do we, as an economics student, do I throw out that lesson of comparative advantage? Is that again a philosophical point of view, or what does economics say?
So Nitin was preparing to tweet this exact tweet. I remember this. He wrote this and he shared the message in the group. So then we were all discussing, and I mentioned the exact same thing. There's a thing called comparative advantage, and whatever you're saying absolutely goes against it.
But where do you teach comparative advantage, and what do you teach there?
Briefly. So, okay, there's a little bit of history to it. So, I mean, how we are taught is Adam Smith came up with absolute advantage, and then Ricardo came up with comparative advantage, right? And I think it's essentially talking about the gains from specialization.
Right.
But I think if our aim is gains from specialization, okay, it makes sense. But sometimes our goal might be, less environmental damage. Our goal might be, wanting just to eat seasonal fruits. So I think that it really depends on the goal, and a little bit of history to this comparative advantage thing, which most people might not know, is at least when Ricardo was writing it, and there's somebody else later who criticizes Ricardo for it, who's somebody called Andre Gunder Frank. So he studied economics, then he moved away from economics. And the reason for that was comparative advantage theory was actually used by British to sort of cut down on Portugal's trade. So whenever convenient, comparative advantage theory has been used to say you should not produce this, and in fact I think what Gunder Frank actually argues is that Britain did better at the cost of Portugal, and part of the reason is this idea of comparative advantage.
A weird form of colonialism.
No, and I mean, if you look at it, all these ideas we spoke about, I mean, I didn't talk about credit rating. Now, I think that why should a small group of people decide how to rate, whether it is the government debt or whether it's a certain company. There is some value to assessment, but I think the metrics of assessment, is it truly happening with enough democratic principles? Is it serving someone else? I mean, these are all, and especially I think in the financial world, this is I think a big question, because there is a hierarchy.
Right. Two follow-up questions. So going back to the question you asked about local communities, it reminded me of one thing. I hadn't written it down, but it reminded me of one thing you said in a talk. You were borrowing the idea from another person, I forget his name. He said, even when people are looking at agricultural change, it's interlinked. So a person buys a tractor, that is linked to the money lender, that is linked to the ultimate this thing. Do you think the way we think about finance is also as this very abstract entity which is just full of individuals making their own individual choices is disconnected from ground realities?
Yeah, no, so the person you're talking about is Krishna Bharadwaj.
Yeah.
So she actually set up the economics department at JNU, and anyway, she is published widely internationally and all that. But it's also sad, actually she has written quite a bit on agricultural economics, but today, I mean, she's not taught. I mean, people don't know of her even within the economics profession.
I'm sorry, she's still around?
No, she's not alive. Yeah. So her ideas are not really taught, but this idea of interlinked markets, which is one, it's about structural interdependence, and two, it is about local patterns of power, right? That and power often defined in caste terms, right? Because then it means that you're at a disadvantage. Now, I think that this is an indigenous idea, as I've argued elsewhere, which, maybe globally people could use this kind of analytical framework elsewhere. I think the way in which it is taught to us is it's all in silos. But the idea of interconnectedness really tells us that if one sector is doing badly, it has a negative consequence on other sectors. And very often there is also a kind of, maybe it has a long history. Of course, in Christianity as well, money lenders have had a bad name. People who make money out of money have had a bad name.
They need to hire McKinsey.
Right? So there is a little bit of that, but I think histories also show that when money is required for expansion of production, financial products are required. Right? So, but I think the key point is, what is the interconnection? And is it that the rate of profit in financial sector is, let's say, 30%, whereas my income is increasing only at 10%. Why does that happen? Right. So that, I think, can be something that we need to figure out. So anyway, we have capital gains tax. Right. Because not everybody has access to that much money to be able to get that kind of return. But I think it's mainly the interconnectedness part and having more regulation on the financial sector, because I think the ease with which you can do financial innovation again, global financial crisis
I
comes
was
to
about
mind.
to say I have a 2008 question, but go on.
It's so simple as opposed to innovating with a washing machine or, toothbrush.
To put you on the spot, too much finance, good thing, bad thing.
I'm not sure, whether it's about too much finance. It's really about the nature of the financial industry, whether there's enough regulation, whether there is enough, there are enough checks and balances in place for, products which can go bust, whether people are actually able to, it's being used in more productive ways which contributes to a healthy economy.
In fact, in your book, I think you mentioned financial services could be an indicator of things going extremely well or things not going well. Is that from your book? I'm pretty sure. So you're giving up the breakup of the services industry as a sort of sub-component, financial services, and it's...
No, so I think that was to say that very often when the financial sector is doing well and the stock markets are going up, we think that the economy is doing well. But it's a mistake because the stock market has got nothing to do with the entire economy as such, and it's only a small portion of it. But the contribution of the financial sector to GDP is an important one, and because of the interconnection, if something bad happens to the financial sector, it has effects all over, which, essentially I think that creativity is good, and I think that's what capitalism allows us. But I think some creativity is certainly bad. Or maybe it can be used for bad purposes. There are examples in everywhere, I think. So I think, how do we regulate? We want optimism, we want creativity, but we also want accountability, we want responsibility, we want, to ensure that people are not disadvantaged in some way or the other. And that is the complex, I think, question, a political and economic question that, we have to figure out a way.
Unless you have something, a closing note, like...
I do have one question. I guess the idealist in me says if we are going to focus on GDP, if that's sort of what we're all economists are focused on, it shouldn't matter how we get that GDP. So what if we could get everyone retrained, reskilled from producing useless plastic things to producing climate-friendly sort of big sort of things that are useful? Would that be possible?
We have two things: Bhutan's World Gross Happiness Index.
Yeah, so I'm not even going to happiness. I'm saying, okay, let's stick with GDP. Okay, so let's not be that idealistic. But is it possible to sort of imagine the economy and have more role for women and also, more importantly, not produce useless things? So I feel like that whole debate about climate goes into, we must degrow, okay, stop growth and degrow. That shouldn't happen. Yeah, I know. So I'm saying, okay, that may be difficult to find buyers for that. Okay, how can we stop the economy from growing? So assuming we want to grow GDP, why can't we change the nature of work to something more useful?
So I agree with you. I think I would say one would be that where the government has to come in strongly with regulation and say, let's produce these goods, or if you produce them, we'll levy a significantly high tax or something. That's one way to go. I think that certainly needs to be there, where the production has to change. It cannot be based on consumer making their choices, because it's too scattered, it's too individualistic, it doesn't work. But I would say the other thing to think about is, just to take care of the concept of growth, can we have more inheritance tax? Can we have wealth tax? Which are in a way also tied to questions of gender justice and caste justice. So that would be, because very often people say population is the problem. It's, I was just looking at that book and yeah, and the interesting thing is, for Britain, which is where we get a lot of ideas from, they really struggle because they didn't have enough people. Now, population was seen as an asset, but somehow when it has come to India, we think that population is a problem. And many people have this strange view, whereas, in a way it is capital. I don't want to use the word capital.
In our industry, though.
Is it because it's not skilled? It's not skilled enough?
There's a massive skill gap for sure.
Yeah, but the skill can always be provided.
So why don't we spend our GDP on doing that?
Yeah. So, but that will not necessarily solve the problem because employment might
Election
not get
time, I
created.
think we can vote for you.
So because people think that if you have education, you'll get a job. But there's no connection between education and getting employed. Employment is also driven by networks in a particular way, availability, whether there is job creation. So, and the skills that you have might not be what the market wants 5 years from now. So many of the engineering graduates so many engineering colleges.
I mean, we have more per capita engineers than pretty much anybody, any country in the world. On this note, we have spoken about, just last two questions. In a weird way, we've only spoken about mistakes so far. So, assuming that somebody outside India is looking in India, listening to this, what are the mistakes you don't want them to make when looking at an Indian lens from their Western lens? I think we have touched upon most of them, but just to summarize.
Yeah, so I would think that it's not, I'm not sure whether it's, I don't think the Indian lens is necessarily better. Right? Because
Disappointing.
I think what we need is, what are the right things that we want to think about? Are we able to appreciate interconnectedness? Do we listen to people? Do we understand the local surroundings? Or are we bringing our framework and saying this is how the world works? Because sometimes I also believe that having some distance from the field helps. Of course, this is a very different from the anthropological view where you are with the subject and the place of study. But I think that both have their merits, but still if we are looking for the wrong things, we are going to find the wrong answers. So I think to me, the real thing is we need to recognize there are multiple paradigms of thought, especially within economics. And certainly within financial economics, more specifically speaking, because we've gone from, I think, the Black-Scholes formula to different kinds of formulas to estimate risk. There are so many theories of estimating risk. There are so many statistical theories, and this is all human choice. So to say that one is necessarily better, it's just a certain kind of presentism where we think, we are in a good spot today, what we know today is good. But I think we need to be critical of that. So
Historical amnesia.
Yeah, yes.
Got it. Before we started recording, I was saying I haven't heard of many Indian economists. I think Amartya Sen comes to mind. You mentioned Krishna Bharaj. Like, are there, for both people in India and outside India, are there more thinkers that they should engage with, like top 5, top 6 names that come to mind?
Yeah, maybe some names that come to mind. So certainly Krishna Bharadwaj, because she is engaged with the history of economic ideas as well as with Indian agriculture. So she has her work firmly in both theory and in more applied work. Then K.N. Raj, who has contributed to planning but also written about agriculture and employment. And many people might not know this, but I think it's also useful to look at Ambedkar's PhD thesis, because he has got 2 PhD theses, one from Columbia and one from London School of Economics, and both are on economics, but more specifically economic history. Right? So again, many people don't know that. I think Kumarappa, J.C. Kumarappa has who's influenced by Gandhian economic thought about the idea of self-sufficiency and a certain challenge to industrialization. And I think bringing multiple people like this, their ideas together, we are able to understand their ideas better, but also maybe figure out what may be possible today or what we would like to achieve.
Whatever happened to the Amartya Sen Bhagwati debate?
I don't know about that debate.
It's very popular when I was young also.
No, and also, sometimes I think of, we say Indian economic thought or Indian thinkers. Even that term Indian I find a little, problematic because, well, me included, I've gone and studied outside India. Right. Amartya Sen is, he spent most of his working career outside India.
As it gets.
Or, so when we say Indian, it's a little difficult because we study Western thoughts.
And it's a certain jingoistic feeling that we need to have our own heroes, so to speak.
And I think that way we're truly global. Right. Because of colonialism in a particular way, we are truly global. Right. And it's, I mean, while it helps to think of it as Indian economists, I think we don't want to go too obsessed with the indigeneity idea, because I think there's a lot of value in learning from different cultures.
I'm out of questions.
Great. Is there anything that we have not discussed that you would like to put on record?
No, I'm tired. So I think no more.
Okay, well, this was great fun. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for making the
I
time.
mean, it is like a master class for me. Personally.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
as well.